Thank you for joining us and welcome to our panelists, starting with my good friend, Wendy Cutler, the Vice President of the Asia Society Policy Institute and the former acting Deputy United States Trade Representative. If you've attended any of our 110 webinars in the past 2 years, you know that Wendy's been on, it feels like about half of those. You know, she's a frequent partner with us. And in fact, she and I hosted together an event looking back at China's entry in the WTO back in December that was looking back from 20 years ago to China's entry at the WTO and what that's meant. Also like to welcome back to the WITC stage, Amy Celico, principal at Albright Stonebridge Group and Dentons Global Advisors. Amy is the former Senior Director for China Affairs at USTR. Bonnie Glaser, also a welcome back to you, Bonnie, Director of the Asia Program and German Marshall Fund of the United States. And a welcome to the first time to the WITC stage to Samm Sachs, Senior Fellow at Yale Law School's Paul Tsai China Center and the New America Foundation, who's a new guest on WITC's webinar platform. Welcome, Samm. And of course, one of my oldest friends in Washington, even though neither of us is very old, Erin Ennis, the Vice President of Global Public Policy at Dell Technologies, who I met when I worked for Senator Jay Rockefeller, and she worked for Senator John Breaux on the Senate Finance Committee. So welcome, Wendy, Amy, Bonnie, and Samm. Erin, take it away.
Ken, thanks so much. And thank you to everyone for joining us for what I know is going to be a fascinating conversation about China, as well as, of course, about U.S.-China trade. Our panelists comprise the keenest observers of China policy in its various facets. There's a lot of firepower on this panel, and we have a short amount of time, so we're going to get right into the discussion. So, Bonnie, I'd like to start with you. To get us started, can you give us a sense of what's motivating Xi Jinping in 2022? And how do you think that can affect what the United States agenda for China is, as well as the region and the world?
Well, thank you, Erin, and thanks to Ken for having me back. And what a great group of women to be chatting about China with this afternoon. What's motivating Xi Jinping in 2022? So the watchword, I think, for this year in China is stability. Last month at the Central Economic Work Conference, the character for stability apparently appeared 25 times in the summary notes. Stability was also emphasized last month by State Councilor and Foreign Minister Wang Yi in his end of the year media interview, where he noted that China desires a favorable external environment for the 20th National Party Congress coming up later this year. And Xi Jinping, of course, wants a smooth transition to his third term in power. He wants to bring his own people, loyalists, onto the Politburo Standing Committee and into the Politburo. But, so this is where I may disagree with some others who are predicting what Xi Jinping is going to do in this coming year. I think that the preference for stability and favorable external environment does not mean that we should expect a quiescent year in Chinese foreign policy. In the run-up to the Party Congress this fall, I think if China perceives that it is being challenged on issues pertaining to sovereignty, I think there's likely to be a very strong response. Xi Jinping clearly cannot appear weak on matters related to sovereignty and territorial integrity. We see this today with Lithuania, for example, which is inadvertently chosen an especially bad time to stand up to Beijing by allowing Taiwan to open up a representative office under the name Taiwan. And this is seen by Beijing, I think, challenging the way China on Taiwan, the way that China is operating in Taiwan's air defense zone, for example. I mean, so the Chinese are punishing Taiwan, they're punishing Lithuania. So I think if we see challenges to Chinese sovereignty, like in the East and South China Seas or along the Indian border, I think that's unlikely to prompt a conciliatory approach if Beijing believes that it's being challenged. As to how this affects the U.S. agenda for China, I'm doubtful that the Biden administration is going to make much headway in dialogue with China this year, to the extent that it even wants to have dialogue for China. And I would question whether that's a priority. But there has been an expression of interest in putting in place guardrails, such as risk reduction measures, to prevent competition from veering into conflict. And I think Xi Jinping may see more risk than benefit in negotiations with the US, certainly on issues relating to nuclear weapons. And Beijing, I think, will continue to condemn US efforts to forge what the Chinese call small circles, coalitions, to protect supply chains and prevent China from gaining access to advanced technology in sensitive areas relating to national security. My very last point is that I think a key variable affecting US-China relations and US policy toward China in 2022 is really whether Russia invades Ukraine and how Beijing positions itself in the event that this take place. So, a Chinese decision to side more closely with Moscow than it did, for example, in 2014 when Russia seized Crimea, and takes significant steps to mitigate the impact of Western sanctions on Russia, could really increase the possibility of the emergence of two competing spheres of influence, sort of liberal democracies versus authoritarianism. So that would be the potential global impact and the worst case scenario.
Bonnie, there was a lot in there. So I'm going to give everybody else their opening round question, but then I'm going to come back to you and maybe do some follow-up. So thank you for that great scene setter. So Wendy, we now have a context set of kind of what the world looks like from China's point of view. In a trade context, at the end of 2021, USTR Tsai said that China hadn't met its phase one commitments. That's the agreement that the Trump administration had negotiated. Kind of given that context of what's going on in China, what types of enforcement actions are most likely from the Biden administration? And maybe kind of a corollary to that, which ones might actually be most effective given that scenario that Bonnie just described?
Well, great question. First, let me just say a lot of firepower on this panel. So I look forward to hearing from my colleagues. Bonnie mentioned the word stability. And, if you look at the phase one agreement, it has brought stability in US-China trade relations, and it has put up guardrails, and it has provided certainty. Many of us may not like certain aspects of it, and particularly the purchasing commitments have been, under a lot of criticism. But we're really now entering an important kind of decision point for the administration. A lot of attention now on how the administration is going to respond to the Chinese shortfalls, not only with respect to the purchasing commitments, but also with respect to certain rules with respect to IPR, agriculture, and other areas of the agreement. Now, since Ambassador Tsai gave her China speech in October, USTR and the Chinese have been in quiet consultations. I mean, ideally coming out of this would be kind of an announcement of some kind of settlement and roadmap forward on how both sides were going to work together to make the agreement work. Maybe China would announce new big purchasing commitments, et cetera. I think Bonnie has kind of thrown some water on that scenario. I don't think it's likely. We don't see any signs of it. So then we're left with this question of enforcement. And we all remember that the negotiation of the enforcement mechanism in phase one was a long drawn out process, and frankly, kind of an unprecedented mechanism under which the US, if it decided to take an action after 90 days of consultations, could basically do what it wants in terms of a proportionate response. It could increase tariffs. It could increase tariff rates on products that are already subject to tariffs. Other tools could be used. But I think we all need to keep in mind that this enforcement mechanism, it may not end with the United States just taking an action. And I think Bonnie did provide some context here that if the US were to take an action and China, quote unquote, viewed that to be not in good faith, and I'm taking language from the actual agreement, its option under the agreement would be to withdraw from the agreement. And I don't think that's in the US interest. I think, again, a lot of important rules were agreed upon. The purchasing commitments, are there, et cetera. Of course, China could respond the way it wants and take more limited action. But at a time when there's a lot of global uncertainty, supply chain disruptions, and inflation, I'm sure this is a path that the administration would be very cautious about, embarking on. And so I'll just conclude and say, I think any announcement by USTR, it may contain some type of launch of an enforcement action, but I don't think that will be it. I think we'll see more about the the Biden administration's approach to US-China trade policy. We may see announcement of other trade actions under US trade laws, including Section 301 or countervailing duty statute. An announcement may include new collaboration or collective actions with our allies and partners. It may include, Biden administration endorsement of improvement of our trade laws to address the types of unfair trade practices and non-market economy practices that China is undertaking. So I think we should all look beyond kind of this narrow lens of the enforcement mechanism in the agreement as we all, think of how, the administration will respond to a shortfall. And I would just conclude and say year-end US data for 2021, according to the Census Bureau, is due February 8th. So by then we should know the exact amount of the shortfall, which folks are saying could be close to 35-40%. Back to you, Erin.
This is an uplifting panel already. I can't wait to see where we go next. Amy, let me turn to you next. You work closely with companies on trade issues in China. I'd love to hear your thoughts on what the United States enforcement options are, but also maybe that other angle of, are new agreements possible? Under the Trump administration, there had been allusions to the fact that a phase 2 agreement was being begun, and I think probably that nomenclature will go away. But are new agreements possible, and if so, what areas would they focus on?
Well, thanks so much, Ken, for including me in this panel, and Erin for facilitating us. I'm just thrilled to be one of the folks talking about this important topic. Just briefly on restrictive actions, potential enforcement actions, and other barriers to trade and investment flows. I do think that many of us listening to policymakers in Beijing and in Washington are assuming that the US and China are going to expand restrictive actions that are going to limit some elements of the economic relationship this year through screenings, investment screenings, both inbound and potentially outbound, export control, supply chain security rules, and of course, application of sanctions for a whole host of economic and national security issues. I'm sure Samm will have something to say about this with regards to technology issues. But what concerns so many of the companies that I interact with is the lack of clarity around when and how more restrictions on trade and investment will be rolled out, and then particularly where are the limitations of these restrictions. So happy to come back to that discussion in Q&A, but I did want to get to your question of, where potentially could the US be focused on in negotiations with China. I think as we all know, the administration should be doing what they're doing, which is pursuing this parallel track when it comes to negotiating and navigating US-China relations. And they've been focused on one of the parallel tracks, and that is talking about China with allies and partners. And clearly, there was an element of that when the president spoke with the Japanese prime minister earlier this month, including discussion of how to coordinate on export control policies vis-a-vis China and other, of course, trade policies too. And this is important work. And I'm glad that the administration is continuing to do it, since our economic competition with China is playing out on the global stage. And so our companies are vying for market access, but our country is also competing with China in bilateral and multilateral relationships. and frameworks on economic and security partnerships with others on the global stage. But talking about China is just one track. And so the second half, which I think we all can agree is less developed, and of course Bonnie is less optimistic about, and I share that pessimism, is the need to include bilateral negotiations with Beijing that underscore that even though we have a competitive relationship, I think both President Biden and President Xi acknowledge that competition defines US-China relations. There's also a need to work together on some issues. And it's easy to point to climate change or North Korea as issues. But I think when I'm talking to my clients, we continue to urge the US government and Beijing to include trade issues there. As difficult as it is, we need to more forcefully advocate for some limited areas of cooperation on trade issues in 2022. One priority, obviously, is reducing or eliminating tariffs, tariffs that are just a legacy of a failed trade policy from the last administration. But another priority is to stress where trade and investment flows actually are beneficial in both economies. And there are real limitations around those areas. But of course, like I believe Wendy mentioned, agriculture is one area. Medicine, we were talking about it in the last panel, energy, and then financial services, healthcare services. These are areas where American companies want to hear from Washington policymakers, from Beijing, how can we continue to thrive in these markets? And we need our governments talking to one another about the importance of those small areas. And I think finally, my final point is, I think that some of these areas should be part of this Indo-Pacific economic partnership that we are starting to talk about. Again, back to that first track of talking with others about US priorities in the Indo-Pacific, one of those priorities being dealing with a competitive relationship with China. And so while we can't talk to China about every one of those buckets of potential cooperation that could form the basis of this Indo-Pacific economic partnership, I think some of the areas we can, like on trade facilitation, easing the restrictions that for products and goods coming and going in and out of our countries, and supply chain resiliency. And so I think those are the areas, as difficult as it will be in 2022, where I think we do need to continue to coordinate with other partners, like Wendy said, but also continue to prioritize talking to Beijing, which will be difficult. And in every discussion, there has to be a focus on reciprocity and a focus on Beijing's policies that undermine the global trading system and certainly put our companies on an unlevel playing field. But without talking about these issues, I'm really worried that those muscles are going to atrophy, and it's going to make China just more forceful in the policies that they're really pushing on the global stage.
Great. Thanks, Wendy. We're going to move over to drill down a little bit more on technology issues. Let me just remind folks who are listening in, please feel free to use the Q&A function. Once we get through everybody's kind of initial questions from me, I'll start working those into the discussion as well. But for the moment, Samm, let's drill down a little bit more on technology issues. China's data and data privacy and cybersecurity policies received a lot of attention in late 2021. What are China's goals with these policies? And given where those goals are in conflict with what the US or other countries' goals are, what's the best way to address those concerns?
Thank you, Erin. And you're right, we've seen a spate of actions in the last few months drawing attention in particular to China's private sector tech companies, tech giants, with the crackdown on Ant Group, the debacle over Didi's failed IPO. But I think something that's important to keep in mind is that China has, for at least half a decade, been building out its legal and regulatory framework for data security and cybersecurity. And so many of the actions that we're seeing are, I view them as a kind of perfect storm, where you have the party moving to demand that the private sector become more efficient carriers in many ways of its vision. But then a multi-year legislative effort to create what, in my view, is the most comprehensive cybersecurity legal and regulatory regime in the world, with the cybersecurity law of 2017 as the scaffolding, and then this fall, the data security law, the personal information protection law, and dozens of regulations and standards, thousands of them. So what's going on here? Is this just about control? And I think it's always important to look at it through multiple lenses. It's yes, and. Yes, this is about control, but it's about a lot more than that. I think there's a genuine effort to have Chinese consumers and online users feel more confident about how their data is being protected from a consumer privacy standpoint online. There is a contingent in the political bureaucracy, the Cyberspace Administration of China, for example, which has been ascendant and increasingly powerful, that if they had their choice, they would lock it all down and put security and first and foremost in ways that might remove China from interconnection in the global trade and investment network. But then you also have elements in the bureaucracy that are very much looking to have Chinese companies play a global role where they are embedded in a network of global connection. So it's all of this at once, which I think is what makes it really difficult for outsiders to look at. And the implications of it are the online content space is getting much more strict. Companies for the first time are looking at the gray zones, the loopholes, that the worst case scenarios or worst case fears when the cybersecurity law took effect in 2017, in many ways actually didn't come to pass, in large part because there was this tremendous debate in the interagency about questions like data ownership, about how do you balance cybersecurity with China's relationship to global trade and investment. So we saw a lot of space for maneuver or slack in the system. And I think the big question at this juncture is, what is the extent to, is that space shrinking, right? What is that space for negotiation? And what are the implications for China's global trade and investment relationships in the world? And in many ways, the elephant in the room always seems to be this question of control over sensitive data. And I think what the US government, if we look at the actions taken by the Trump administration, many tools inherited by the Biden administration around controlling the outbound flows of American citizens' data handled by Chinese tech platforms, as well as potential outbound investment restrictions and the like, where data security is a real core issue. I think what the Trump administration was trying to do was sort of create these new walls around American citizens' data. And maybe in large part driven by reciprocity, as Amy mentioned, as an important tool. The Biden administration has come in, there was an important executive order in June 2021 that rescinded the bans on TikTok and WeChat and basically said, look, this approach to a sort of ad hoc, we're going to play whack-a-mole with a rotating cast of Chinese companies is no longer going to work. Instead, we want to take a more consistent approach to evaluating what is the national security implication of having quote unquote transactions between American and foreign adversary companies, Chinese companies. And they established at a high level a framework to evaluate that risk. The question is, how do you actually do that? And the language that they put out there was very compelling. It said the goal is to maintain an open, interoperable, and secure internet. Great. So how do we do secure and open and interoperable at the same time in a way that doesn't become a de facto ban on any transaction with a Chinese company? And I think there's a reason we haven't seen a resolution to that question yet, because that's really hard to do in practice. Now, if I had my way and the type of recommendations I would give, just very briefly, and happy to talk more about this. The first thing is, and this is why it's important, this is a trade discussion. I think we are primarily looking at data through the lens of national security. And there's an important that doesn't look at data through the lens of trade. And I know Wendy Cutler and I have talked at length about the idea that maybe trade agreements need to be updated, the concept of how do you account for the rapid pace of technology and the realities of technology in international trade agreements. And I would love to hear more from Wendy on that topic, because I think we can't just look at data from a national security perspective. Trade has a big role to play. The other is we are essentially legislating privacy right now through the lens of the China threat. So if you look at all of the legislation coming out of Congress, federal privacy law has stalled. Instead, we're looking at national security walls around preventing data flows to certain countries in ways that I think make us not necessarily more secure or privacy protective. So having comprehensive federal privacy law would be a really important tool. There are also initiatives underway, like at the OECD, where how do you come up with common principles among governments to safeguard data as it flows across borders, and particularly grappling with this question of law enforcement access to data. How do you do this and create coalitions of countries to do it? The big question again is who's in the club, who's in the coalition or not. And I think the Biden administration has really put forward a vision for this, which is democracies versus authoritarian governments. But what are the implications if you just have clubs of democracies sharing data? And what are the implications of that in terms of security and global trade? And that needs to be reckoned with as well. And finally, I think there's a role for technical solutions. So encryption, creating privacy protective learning, ways that can build security into the design. So it's policy and technical tools working hand in hand. So those are just a few ideas, but I think the core idea is walling off data from a sort of US digital sovereignty perspective is probably not going to be the most secure or privacy protective. And we need to think about the second and third order consequences of that.
Great, thanks, Sam. All right, there is a lot to digest in all those comments. So I want to, and there's some great questions coming in on the Q&A function. So let me start with one coming back to you, Bonnie, since you kicked us off and you touched on some of the issues over the top. Another issue that got a lot of attention in 2021 was tensions between China and Taiwan, including risks to global supply chains, given how central Taiwan is for so many industries. What's the current state of play on those issues, and what does the risk look like for supply chains in 2022?
Well, if you're talking about the risk of supply chains because of Chinese military pressure on Taiwan, there are obviously supply chains for lots of other reasons.
Sure, of course.
But relating this to China's policy toward Taiwan, it's my view that Xi Jinping is just the latest in the long line of Chinese leaders that has called for reunification. And in fact, much of what Xi Jinping has said about Taiwan echoes what prior leaders have said. The question is, how does reunification rack and stack in the other, the priorities that Xi Jinping has for China, and what is his cost-benefit analysis? Does Xi Jinping really think that China could use force against Taiwan and avoid a military conflict with the United States? Is he confident that the Chinese military could succeed? Does he think that Taiwan would raise the white flag and surrender? And my answer to these questions is basically that for Xi Jinping, preventing independence remains the highest priority when it comes to Taiwan. China still is very confident that it can do that. It's still not very confident about reunification in the near term through military means or any other means. But at the end of the day, if we look at what China is amassing to deal with Taiwan, it's this very expansive toolkit of coercive capabilities. It's not just military, it's economic as well. It's very interesting that the head of the Far Eastern Group, which has a great deal of money invested in factories in China, was fined a hell of a lot of money a few months ago because he was providing support funding for DPP candidates, in addition to KMT candidates, by the way, because that's what Taiwanese business does. They just support both sides and hope to benefit from that, or at least not suffer any negative.
Some of us do that here too.
It happens everywhere. So, but that shows that maybe China is willing to incur some cost in its punishment against Taiwan. That's a red flag that I think we do have to watch going forward. And I think that TSMC and other companies in Taiwan may end up getting squeezed more because the demand for the chips that the fabs, particularly, of course, TSMC, and then there's other companies that are doing design work, the demand is just going to continue to increase. And the United States, I think, is concerned and wants to ensure that our companies get adequate supply, and also want to see TSMC building some of its fabs elsewhere outside of Taiwan. And frankly, I think TSMC feels like with the Arizona one they're planning, that's like been there, done that. We checked their box, and I think they want to keep most of the foundry work that they're doing in Taiwan.
Great, thank you, Bonnie. Amy, you had mentioned in your comments, and I suspect both you and Wendy have some thoughts on this, something that came up in the Q&A function. So what are your thoughts on the Indo-Pacific framework and where that fits into the US approach to China? Recognizing even just today, right before this panel, I saw that Bob Davis has a piece, strangely, since his retirement, published in the Politico magazine. But what are your thoughts about where this is going and how that fits into the US strategy?
Well, it's a great piece. Let me say it's a terrific piece that talks about exactly your question. And where's China in that and what's happening? I'll also give a plug for a piece that Evan Medeiros and Mike Green just published in Foreign Affairs today, talking about what is our economic policy towards and security towards the Indo-Pacific region. And they too also talk about this economic framework that clearly is coming together with different elements for talking about American leadership and engagement in the region, whether it's on trade facilitation or digital trade, which I agree with Samm. While it's dangerous only to have democracies talking about issues, I think it's going to be very, very challenging to include China in those kinds of conversations in a trade context. And so this framework agreement is meant to be an alternative to talking about a trade agreement. It's going to be, and I really defer to Wendy on how this is possible, different enforcement tools, different mechanisms, even for approval. Whether or not it's going to require congressional approval is I think, still an open question. And so clearly what's, I think, important for all of us to know about this economic framework that is going to supposedly be released in the coming weeks is that the administration is thinking about this holistically and thinking about how it can engage in the region more proactively to compete with China, but also to demonstrate that we are not only concerned about security issues when we talk about our strong presence as a Pacific nation. We also care deeply about deepening our economic relationships. And so there are, I believe, six different buckets of activity there. And while it's not talking, it doesn't directly address China, it's clearly talking about competition with China in extending this American participation, leadership, talking about these trade issues. But let me turn it over to Wendy.
Well, just following up on what Amy said, I mean, one thing I would just make clear that at least my understanding is that a decision has been made that while there will be consultations with Congress, the types of arrangements they'll be seeking under this framework will not require congressional approval. But just taking a step back, I mean, for the good news is the Biden administration totally gets they need a robust economic agenda for the Indo-Pacific. So that's great. The challenge is once you take trade and market access off the table, how do you shape a meaningful agenda that offers something to a whole range of our allies and partners in the region? And that's exactly what the administration's working on. I think they've also gotten the message that this can't be like an anti-China initiative. each of the, the initiatives that fall under these 6 categories or 7 buckets that Amy mentioned would need to stand on their own based on what the United States affirmatively wants with respect to supply chain resiliency or decarbonization or trade facilitation. And so I think that's going to be extremely important to phrase all of this in a affirmative, positive way. As Amy said, we're expecting the details to be rolled out. I will just say that based on my conversations with many old friends, new friends in the region, they're trying to keep an open mind, but for many of our CPTPP partners, they feel China tapping on their shoulder to get in the CPTPP and feeling that pressure and wanting very much to have some kind of credible alternative or some kind of hope that the US at some point would consider returning to the CPTPP, albeit with some important revisions.
Maybe we can turn to one of the points that Samm raised in her comments, and that is that maybe data needs to be viewed as a trade issue, not just national security. Is this the kind of issue that we can even find enough consensus between the United States and our, generally viewed trading partners on this that might be worthwhile to pursue? Or is that one that, kind of we're dealing with a challenging period right now enough that bridging those differences may be too far to go? And I open up to any of you who would like to jump in on that one.
Well, maybe I can just start and say that a digital component is on the agenda for this Indo-Pacific economic framework, and I'm pretty confident it's going to include some data work, data provisions, data cooperation. I mean, we'll have to see how far and deep it goes, but aspects of data and digital are important trade issues. But frankly, they do go beyond trade as well. And that's always the challenge in dealing with these issues. And I think going forward, in 5-10 years, when we're in a panel like this talking about trade and data and digital, it's going to be such a different world, and trade will just be one part of what I would call like a digital economy agreement, because it involves so many other aspects beyond trade. But trade is an important element of the discussion.
Great, thanks, Wendy. We've got about 5 minutes left, so let me ask one question that it feels like we cannot stop talking about in the trade world, and that is tariffs. At this point, we're a year into the Biden administration, no indications that the tariffs are going to be lifted. Should we start viewing these tariffs as permanent at this point? Amy, maybe I can put you on the spot on that one.
Well, I think realistically speaking, I'm the one who suggested that tariffs should be part of our bilateral discussions with China, and I believe that. But I also really do acknowledge how difficult it is for the US to lift those tariffs if we don't get something for it. And so I do think rather than accepting that they'll be here forever, we should just prepare for the short-term consequences of continued tariffs. And of course, that is to be able to get more exemptions for the tariffs in the short term. But I absolutely believe that the US side should be continuously saying to the Chinese side, if you do X, then we lift those tariffs, you lift the retaliatory tariffs. It's good for the relationship. Don't we want to show something that's good for the relationship?
Thanks, Amy. All right. Let me put maybe one last question out there on this. There has been some discussion about the United States potentially, or Congress is considering some legislation about restricting outbound investments to China. Any thoughts on either the wisdom of that or the misgivings we should have about that?
I'm happy to just say it is very challenging. It is a very popular idea. I think whoever asked the question knows about the congressional movement on this. There are absolutely national security implications of investments that go to China and support military modernization or support areas of the Chinese economy that are competing with the US economy. And so I wouldn't say it's an outlandish idea at all. However, I think we need to move with real consideration. And I don't think this year is the year for that work. In order to put in place a new framework to govern outbound investment screening. But as you know, from inbound investment screening revisions, it was a multi-year process. It was a very thoughtful process that required Congress and the administration working together. And so I think that's what it's going to entail, to put in place some kind of framework to really formally screen outbound investments. Obviously, the business community will be very concerned about where those restrictions exist around the purview of that kind of review.
Great, thanks, Amy. Bonnie, go ahead, Wendy.
I would just add that it is gaining a lot of momentum. And so, a couple of years ago, when it wasn't included in a bill that went forward, everyone thought that they'd won the battle and they'd convinced Congress. It is gaining momentum. So folks who have concerns should really think about not how you delete it necessarily, but how do you narrow it to really get at, the core concerns, versus passing something that's very vague, will be difficult to implement, and frankly, very difficult to even draft regulations to implement.
Great. Bonnie, last word to you. From the national security side, any thoughts on kind of what that might look like and what advantage it would give us if we started to restrict outbound investment into China?
Well, I think that this is an objective worth considering, and it was considered in the Trump administration, although it didn't get very far. And now the Biden administration is trying to move the ball forward. And I think Wendy's right, it has to be done very smartly. This is not something that should be very broad. And Amy is certainly right that it's going to be very complex to deal with Congress and the business community and the different constituent groups. Of course, what nobody has talked about yet is that this can't just be the United States that is going to be limiting our outbound investment into China. We have to work with allies on this. Otherwise, what's the point? When I read the Trade and Technology Council readout, I thought it was interesting that this issue was not mentioned, although I know it is on the agenda. It just hasn't made it to the point, of course, of being a high priority, because it's hard, because we have to actually get our own house in order first, decide what our approach is going to be, make sure we have the right tools, and then talk to our allies and partners. So I agree with Wendy. This is just going to take, I think, a very long time, but I think it's worth thinking through. And I think that smart people are beginning to do that, because from a national security perspective, we need to be limiting China's access to certain kinds of technology, which we haven't done enough in the past. We have shown we have the ability, for example, to end pretty much Huawei's smartphone market, their ability to produce smartphones, but yet we haven't applied that tool to other Chinese companies. So we have to think through the way that we're doing this and ensure we have allies and partners on board.
Great. Thanks so much, Bonnie. Ken, back to you.
Thank you all so very much. We are incredibly grateful to all of you for joining us. I am really sorry that I had to cut this conversation short. There is so much to talk about. Erin warned me before we got started. She said, Ken, I don't know how we're going to cover everything, but you covered a lot. You just left open the door for us to do more and invite all of you back again. Not just Wendy, who we have on frequently and who's a partner in so much we do here. Amy, Bonnie, Samm, Erin, a pleasure to see you all and have you on the WITC platform. Thank you very much.